Thanks for joining our webinar today. I am Randy Sainer, a Beef Systems Extension Educator with the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. You can find archive of our past webinars and a schedule of upcoming webinars on our website at cap.unl.edu. For the last several years, the Nebraska Extension Beef Team has created a short document that forecasts the expected value of replacement heifers. These are intended to be used as a guide in what cow replacement costs might be, given the current future expectations of cost and markets, and reflect what might happen over the life of the purchased animal. The forecast is also aimed to help individuals create a reference point for their own situation and expectations of future events, and to use their own ideas to arrive at what a reasonable value might be for a heifer purchased or retained for replacement. Joining with me today is Matt Stockton, an agriculture economist with Nebraska Extension. Good morning, Matt, or good afternoon, or noon, Matt.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, we're going to talk about annual replacement costs, and we're going to give you some ideas from our perspective so that you can make a good decision and not pay too much, or I guess too little. I don't know if you can ever pay too little, but yeah.
Let's go to our next slide. So when selecting a replacement heifer, it differs from ranch to ranch, but the value for both retained and purchased replacement heifers generally depend on, number one, longevity, and that's the replacement heifer's ability to stay in the herd as a productive unit, the heifer's productive life. We know that some heifers may fall out at the 3rd year they're in the herd, some may fall out at the 10th year they're in the herd. So longevity is going to be very important. Keeping that heifer in the herd is going to affect profitability. Also, productivity, the size and quality of the calf she produces is going to be important, as well as for her value in the weight of the calf and the quality, as well as it would sell at a market. The other things that might also be is compatibility. So both the genetic and phenotypic with herd mates. So is this heifer similar to what you got for cows? Or are you buying something completely different, which is not going to match your calves when they're born? And does this heifer conform to the production style and performance goals that you use? Everybody has different goals, of course. And then your operator goals and management style is going to be different among ranches. So heifers' contribution to current needs and to their future plans of that operation are going to be really important, in that you know what your goals are and what type of management. If you're a highly intensive managed program, may be different than if you're one that's very low feed, low maintenance type operation. So your management style is going to be important. And then Matt, you want to talk about financial standing?
I do, but before we go on, understand is that this report is primarily based on several factors. One is longevity and productivity. That's why they're bolded there. And these other factors are things that we didn't control for in our study, and those are things that you're going to have to control for. And so basically, how long does this cow survive in your herd? And I don't mean survive, but productively survive. And how productive is that animal? How much does she produce? Makes a big difference on what you can afford to pay for her. And Randy mentioned that these cows are different lengths and different ones. So you buy one heifer, it's kind of like playing Russian roulette with cows, so to speak. You don't know what they're going to do until they do it. But this study is based on an average value based on different call rates. Go ahead, Randy, move this slide forward, or Ryan. Okay, so as we talked about, longevity, productivity, they're the two ones at the top in the purple. Now, other things that affect it. Cattle values in the future, and this is based on calf prices. Of course, we also know there's a price slide, and that's also included in the model. But then where do we get these future values of these animals? Well, FAPRI, which is an organization in Missouri that has macroeconomic models, makes forecast annually of the next 10 years, and that's what we use. We also have the future value of the cows and what they're worth when you sell them. In other words, so you have an animal, you have the purchaser for a value, and then you have the seller. Well, we know there's a cattle cycle and some things in there. Well, Fapri hopefully takes that into account in their future forecast. Then we got, like I said, the longevity and the cow purchase raised. Now, this doesn't matter whether you raise or purchase an animal, because that cost is true. Whether you go down to the auction and buy it, or you go down to your neighbor and buy one of his, or whatever you do, or hers, that's going to be a cost. But if you also don't sell that animal, keep that animal, retain that animal, pay for all its room and board and all the things that you have to pay for to get it up to breeding size and age and eventually have a calf, those are costs as well. So these values work for both.
Also, Matt, we also put in pasture and feed costs that are representative of Nebraska too. So this has got some Nebraska values to it.
Yeah, I guess I kind of neglected that, Randy. It's a good point. So where did we get those values, Randy?
So the university does a rental rate survey every year, and this is from that north central part of the state, in the Sandhills areas, where we use those rental rates for that. And then also they have a budgeting program, and we use Central Nebraska 600 cow herd for the budgeting part of that. And that's the budget that producers help university put together.
The other thing too is, I think didn't we also use some things from to try to ground truth it, if you will. We looked at Kansas, and then we also, you as a producer yourself kind of looked at it and said, these didn't sound right, or these, you kind of confirmed the fact that, hey, these were reasonable, that were relative to cost as you witnessed it out there in the market itself. So that's where all the costs and all those kind of things come from.
Next slide.
Okay, the main factors that affect replacement value, here they are, they're listed again. We've kind of talked about them, but as a review, cow replacement costs. In other words, when you buy and sell a cow, the salvage value that you get versus the price you paid for, hopefully that difference is going to be a loss or a gain depending on what she did during her productive life on your ranch. So in a sense, you have to count that as depreciation, and that's accounted for in the model. So the prices that we're going to talk about today, or values, don't include this salvage value and this cost difference. What that is accounted for in the model, but it's not in the actual price that we started with. They're actually just all the costs associated with producing the animal, except for the replacement cost of the animal. We got a 2% death rate. We've got pounds of calf she produces per year, and that's average pounds of calf, because some cows don't produce a calf. So we have a calving rate. So this assumes, I believe, a 92% calving rate. And the longevity of cow depends on replacement. We have 3 different types of replacement values as far as cull values. We have 14, 20, and 28%. Years ago, 20% was considered a pretty normal calving cull rate for herds, according to a Sandhill survey we did. Oh, it's probably 15 years ago now. Now, maybe it's better or different than that. But so that's kind of the middle of the road. A low cull rate would probably be around 14. And, 28% is a pretty excessive cull rate. On an average every year basis. And then, of course, calf value, and it said it's on the slide, depending on the size of the calf. Randy, what size of calves are we?
So we're using about 5 to 550 weight calves.
Okay. And total cost per cow obviously varies by our management scheme and how we're feeding her, how much supplement, how much our pasture costs. But the primary costs are going to be your forage costs and those sorts of things. Next slide.
Next slide.
You want to talk about this?
Go ahead. I'll let you do this. I'll do
Okay. Well, we used, notice the word calculate up there. We at the University of Nebraska really like to spell things properly so that people can read them. So we did this in this case, and the calculator is basically we want to calculate or figure, and so we use that form of. We thought that was actually a pretty good fund. We don't know, whatever, but we like it. The coming season's annual cost of production for the cows, there's three of them. We went with the high, medium, and low. The low one was $741.41. Now remember, this does not include replacement costs. And then $881.71 per cow for the middle. So in other words, that middle of the road. And then the high cost was $992.54. We also included a calving rate of, on average, 92%, but it could vary anywhere from about 89 to about 96. So on the average, it was 92%. Cow replacement cost, that varied by year. So that, according to what FAPRI said, we went along with, and we used kind of Nebraska prices to adjust that to make it so it would be relative to Nebraska. Cow depreciation, that depended on your call rate. In other words, your depreciation, average depreciation is different than individual animal depreciation. And what I mean here is very, very basic. Basically speaking, you buy a cow and she only lasts one season, or she doesn't even last a season. What's her depreciation rate? Well, it's pretty steep. You probably lost a lot of money on her if she dies or something bad happens to her and she doesn't have a calf and you end up selling her. That's a pretty high depreciation, because the difference of what you paid for, what you got wasn't very much, was a lot. Whereas if you have a cow for 10 years, she's got a lot of years to pay for herself, so the depreciation rate on an annual basis wasn't really that high. So the cow depreciation changes by cow. And what this model did is it didn't do the average, it did various ones and had different life expectancies based on the roll of the dice, so to speak, based on a distribution of how often you cull and the death rate and all those other things we talked about. And it came up with a value and then did this 500 times to come up with the average. And then of course we have death loss and everything else. Next slide.
So as Matt said, our cow costs were $747.41 for the low, $881.71 for the average, and $992.54 for the high. And the annual costs were adjusted for FAPRI's percent change in costs, meaning that as time goes along, inflation happens, prices go up. So it's adjusted for that in cost. And if you'll look at last year's, our costs this year were higher, maybe not high enough the way inflation went, but our costs are higher this year than they were last year. And that's due to the fact that inflation costs go up. And then we adjusted costs for the 22 ag real estate report, which we said was the rental rates for that northern part of Nebraska, that north central. And there were our rates. We had a low of $47.95 per cow calf pair. This was if you paid rent, and then an average pasture rate of $61.45, and then a high of $71.40 per cow.
This was per month, Randy?
Yeah, per cow per pair per month. Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then winter rates were figured at half those in the summer.
Which is a pretty common thing that I've gotten from the survey, is that that's about what the winter rates would run. Now yours may run differently, and if they do, you need to account for that in your cost.
Right. And depending on whether you're doing corn stalks or range, that could make a difference too. Next slide.
We actually had 30 days of corn stalks in ours, I believe. And then we also had about a month of hay feeding after calving before it turned out to green grass, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. And we had a little bit of winter range too.
Okay. You want to talk about this one?
Yeah. So if we look at feed costs, the between the bottom and top percent share of cost as far as total cost, we had a low of 35% for pasture, up to 42%. If we look at pasture as a percent of feed cost, 67% versus 70. So 70% of your cost is in that pasture. In other words, and then feed cost of all your total costs, we had 51% versus 61. So those higher costs, that higher cost had those higher feed costs, higher pasture cost, and higher total cost.
I would say too, Randy, that when you're looking at this, you're thinking about, okay, so pasture, in other words, if I just take my pasture cost out and said, what percent of my total cost of production is that? And that excludes your depreciation. That's about 35 to 42% of your cost. And if I look at pasture as a percent of feed cost, which is your total feed cost, which would be supplementation, corn stalks, and all these other things we talked about, it's about 51 to 61%. Okay, but then feed cost as a percent, well, I'm sorry, 67 to 70% is the pasture. I said the wrong one. And then feed cost in general is about 51 to 61% of all the costs associated with having that cow.
Next slide. So we defined some things and some assumptions in the forecast. And cow longevity, this is just the expected future replacement rate. This is the number of heifers needed each year to replace those cows to maintain the herd. So if we're maintaining the same size herd. So if you have a higher call rate, that means you're replacing more cows. And so we used 14%, 20%, and 28% call rate. Just remember that the larger call rate or annual replacement rate means you're buying more cows to replace them because they're falling out sooner.
You want to use it? Sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
Before you moved on, I wanted to make a point. That 14, 20, and 28% would be a consistent average annual call rate. In other words, you might call 15% one year, you might call 13% or 10, different percentages on an annual basis. But what we did is, because of the mathematics and the way it works out, we use this as an average number. So that 14% was the average replacement rate, 20% was an average replacement rate, and 28%. So in other words, if you consistently, year after year for the next 10 years, on average, called at 14%. Now, you see, that's going to change, because if you call too much different than that, it could change what you can pay one year versus another year. But we just assumed as an average and kept it constant, somewhat.
So cattle prices, both calf and cow values, were forecast for the next 10 years. We said due to FAP, we've already kind of talked about that. And prices for calves were adjusted according to historical price slide values. So as a calf gets bigger, there's a slide in value in that calf. And so those were taken into consideration.
There's also a difference in gender as well, but we figured a 50-50 mix.
Right, we figured an average, yep, of both genders. Annual percentage change in cost for the next 10 years for FAP, we talked about that. And then productivity, cow size, calving rate, calf size, calf gender, cow age, weaning rate, death rate, etc. And we used historical cow records of past production from the Goodman Sandhills lab ranch were used to simulate that productivity. So it was simulated off of some research from our Goodman Sandhills lab.
So for example, if we had a small cow and she produced a calf, that calf probably didn't weigh as much at weaning, but the cow was smaller. And so that actual cow would be drawn, and her cost would vary by her size and the length of her life and a bunch of other factors. So it was all accounted for. And so this physical data was simulated from or randomly drawn from a herd representing a herd of 100, but it's actually ended up being, you could be any size because it would be in percent terms.
Next slide. So again, that's just our low, our mid, or average rate, 14, 20, and 28. We just talked about that. So we go to the next one. So this was our prices, our break-even prices on non-borrowed money. So we're not borrowing any money. We're pulling that money out of the ranch budget to buy those heifers.
Randy, do you want to explain what you mean by break-even?
So that would mean that the heifer, actually, when you sell her at the end of her life, what you get for her and what she got, she paid for herself through her calves and her value.
So that $2,227.09 would be on average, if I called 14% and had low cost, I would have on average broken even on those heifers that I purchased for that price.
Right, right. And so as you see, as replacement rate changes, as we replace more heifers, we have to replace more of them, the price you can pay is lower because you have to buy more, and you're having to replace them more often.
They don't last as long, do they?
Nope, and all of us have, we've all bought heifers, or I've bought heifers anyway, and that's exactly what happened. Some of them did really well, and some of them are gone 2 or 3 years after I bought them, sometimes the first year after you bought them, because they didn't breed back. So that's what this figures in on average.
Yeah, so in other words, if you're replacing your heifers all the time at 28%, you can pay about what, $800 less per head, because that replacement cost, because of the continual replacement and the longevity is such that it causes that cow to bring in less money, which makes it valuable, worth less, because the probability of it lasting in the herd is less, because at 28% replacement rate, you got to be getting rid of animals at a fairly brisk rate.
And the important thing is to know is if you can buy heifers that last longer, you can pay more for them. And the same way with your own herd, if you're picking heifers that stay in the herd, you could put more money into them than heifers that are going to fall out right away.
What also tells you too, right? Though, exactly. I that is absolutely correct. But what I would also say as an economist, I'm looking at this going, what it means though, is that the depreciation loss is greater when you replace animals more frequently.
Correct. Yep. Next slide.
Oh, did you, before you went to the next slide, did you want to talk about the differences among the cost?
Yeah, so yeah, sure. We didn't do that, did we? So if you look at cost, again, cost is really important. So if we can hold that cost down for cows, and it's hard right now with inflation the way it is. But if you can control your costs and try to keep them down, you can pay more for heifers because you don't have as much in them, or you make more money per calf because your costs are less. So you can pay more for that heifer because she's going to pay back more. If your costs are higher, that means your return is going to be lower, and your revenue is going to be lower, and you're not going to be able to pay as much for her. And so the higher, as your costs increase, that means you have less money you can pull out of your cow budget to pay for the next set.
Right. So looking at the 28% cull rate, right, with the high cost, which is the gray colored bar, you can only pay $830 a head for heifers, which I'm not sure what you're going to get for $830, but I'm not sure that you want to buy what you're going to get for $830, but that would be a break-even value. So in other words, if I have that high cost of 982, what is it? What did you say? 981.54 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whatever that cost is at high cost, you're going, oh my goodness gracious, with that cost, and I have to replace them 28% of the time, I pay $830 for them. Whereas if I had a lower call rate, even at the higher cost, I could pay over $1,000 for them. And so the same is true of the middle cost and the low cost.
So when looking at your operation, if you're having that problem, you might try to figure out why that's happening so you can change, so you can afford to pay more for them. That would be the management kind of decision you can make when you're looking at this.
If indeed the factory prices hold and things hold like we're talking about, and you're only affording to be able to pay like that $1,000 or $800 for a heifer, your costs basically are too high, and you're going to have a really hard time surviving in the long run, because heifers don't cost $800 or $1,000 each.
Yep. And then of course, if we look at interest rates, and we probably figured actually a lower interest rate than we should have, the way interest rates have gone up. But if you borrowed 50% of the money, this is not borrowing the whole amount, but if you borrowed 50% of your money to buy those heifers because you didn't have it in your budget to buy more than 50%. So you give 50%, the bank borrows 50% against them. You can see that reduced what you could pay for those heifers. And just like your cost and your replacement rate reduced the amount just like before, but remember, you're paying about $100 less at this rate. Not quite, but close, over $100 less. So, and with interest going up, that's going to be a big decision when you're buying heifers. You need to watch that interest cost because it can really reduce what you can afford to pay.
Right. So like at the 14%, I've got that low rate of call. That's my call rate. That call rate also includes cows that self-call, like die. So in other words, you see what I'm saying? So that 14% is got death rate kind of included in it as well. So when you're looking at that, you're going, okay. So if I'm paying, like, let's say I'm a middle cost person, if I'm paying $1,600 a head for my heifers, and on average, I can only afford to pay $1,400, that $200 has got to come from somewhere. And, you know, cash flow and some things, this is going to end up having you borrow money. So the more you borrow money, the less you can pay for your heifers. And the higher the interest rate, the less you can pay for those heifers, because that's a cost that's not there when I mean, it's an opportunity cost, but that's money out of pocket.
And it could affect your bottom line, is what we're saying.
Yeah,
For your
absolutely.
operation.
And your cash flow and those kinds of things. And that's what you want to be looking at.
Next slide. This is just a difference, and I talked a little bit about this. This is just a difference if you borrowed money versus non-borrowing money. And you can see that it makes a difference in that you know, you can pay less per animal for those cattle that you borrowed money on, just like we talked about. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Good point, Randy. I like what you said there, but I also would like to point out that look at your 28% call rate, replacement rate. So you're looking at this and going, well, wait a minute. I lose $166.07 if I have a high cost. What it means is you're not making enough money to pay that back. And the difference has to be greater to make up for the fact that you're probably losing money at that higher input cost, or you're potentially making a lot less money. And so you can service a loan less. And so it's going to cost you have to pay that much less for that cow. So in other words, whenever you borrow money, it's worse when you're not doing well. Whereas on the other hand, it's probably least effective when you have a situation where you have that low cost and a low replacement rate. But even looking at the high replacement rate, it's even less, or the high cost when you're doing the low replacement. So in other words, having heifers replaced at a lower level cause you to lose less money more frequently, and your investment is safer. And so as a result of being safer, the difference is going to be less. Now that difference doesn't mean, but remember, not only is the difference might be less for the higher cost, the difference between the higher cost of replacement would be less than it would be for the the other values. And when you look at that, you're saying, okay, but when I have the higher cost, I can already not afford to buy as expensive a heifer. I have to buy a lower valued heifer, so that even though it's only $65.43, you're still a lot worse off as far as your replacement cost. So really, while the difference is less, the point is there is a difference, and at that higher cost, you're having a trouble surviving. And that's the important thing to remember here. And I'm not saying you're not going to survive. I'm just saying at that higher cost, even with the higher price of cattle that we got in there, which we do have fairly high price of cattle in there, and FAPRI is saying it's going to stay good with the inventories and some of the things we got, you're still going to be in trouble as far as what you can pay for heifers. Because remember, that was only $1,000, I believe, $23. So you're not in a good position to be purchasing valuable animals at a high cost. Now, if your replacement cost is less than $1,000 because you can raise them for less than that, which I don't think that's going to work, because the value of the heifer is sold on the market is going to be too much for that to happen. It's going to be interesting situation. So I think the key here is you need a lower cull rate and a lower cost is a better place to be.
Okay, next slide. This is replacement rate, and every 1% increase in replacement rate, what it does, and again, you can see that it, as you increase your replacement rate, what you can pay decreases. And same way with borrowed money, it's just a little bit more. However, Matt, explain the high one to me. Why is that just $2.01?
Okay, so we have borrowed money, which is going to give the other one at top is $7.48. So
right.
What you're saying is for every 1% increase in call rate or in replacement rate. So in other words, you're going from, let's say, 14 to 15% between the 14 and 20% range. In other words, you're limited to that range where it's valid. So basically you lose $2.01 that you can pay to break even for every 1% increase in call rate. We're going to show you a table where you can use it, where it uses this information so that you can, let's say, so for example, let's say your cost is $800. It's not $744, and your call rate is 17% or whatever. We're going to show you how to figure out what the break-even value is using some tables. This is the information that supplies those tables, and I'm not so sure, but basically it kind of tells you that, okay, for example, on the top one, non-borrowed money, I have the low cost, 700, and I have let's say 16% interest. Well, remember, it was $2,200 for that replacement value to break even. But what this says is because my call rate is 2% higher, goes from, let's say, well, or 3% higher, I would have to multiply 3 times that negative $45, which would be almost $150. I could only pay $150 less for that heifer just due to the fact that my call rate was that much higher. And that's what these tables are kind of saying. For every 1% call rate increase between 14 and 20, and then you got between 20 and 28, and then you've got the different ones for, you know, the high, low, and average, depending on where your cost is. So you can kind of get an idea what it is. Well, you can do the math yourself, but we have a table that'll make it easier for you to do it, which we're going to show you here in a minute.
So next slide.
And this one, it has to do with changes in a dollar value. So in other words, for every dollar increase or decrease, what does it do to that value for break even? So, I mean, you start out with a break even value that we've given you from the table, and you say, okay, so at 14 replacement rate, if I have a dollar increase in cost, so in other words, rather than the was it 734 or 735? It says here
735.
747. We didn't change this number, Randy.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be 747, and I'm not sure that in fact, these are last year's numbers. Somehow we got a bad table. Okay, so, but point is, if my costs go up that dollar, I'm going to have a $2.60 reduction in my break-even value. So if I started at $2,200 and I have a $1 increase in cost over what we list there, that means I actually can pay $2.60 less between those $2 values. And the table that we're going to show you last will show you those exact amounts. But basically what we're saying is every dollar that you increase cost is going to cost you X amount of dollars in break even. So in other words, if you had a $2,000 break even and you had a $10 increase in cost and you had that $2.60, so you'd have you could pay $26 less to break even. Because it'd be $22.60 times the $10 change. That's how it would work. Next slide, please. And as promised, here's the tables.
Right.
Okay, Randy.
So let's say that your costs was not $881.71. It was $795, and you had a 15% call rate. So you would go across to 15%, $7.95. That's $1,950 is your break even. So you can see that it gives you kind of in $10 increments. So if you have different price than what we've listed, which most people are not going to have the exact same, you can use this table to figure that out. Let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of discuss another example.
So there's an example. Here we go.
Yep. There's the Mighty Fine Ranch. Its cost is $7.67 per cow and a replacement rate is 17%. What would be the break-even price? And so we would go back up to the table and look at 767 and 17%, and that break-even price would be $2,001 per cow. And that's kind of how you figure it. If that same ranch were to borrow half the money, you can go down to the next table, and the next table, and it'll tell you that you can only pay $1,894.
So these slides are not in the Beef Watch article, but there's a link in the Beef Watch article to the full article, and you can find those tables in that full article. Now, here's what's kind of cool. Let's just give you one more example. Let's suppose that you had a cost that was $900 even. So the closest we have is $899. Well, let's say we have a 19% call rate. Well, at $899 at 19%, we have $1,191 is what we say is our forecasted say that you could pay for a heifer. Now, obviously, that may or may not work for you, and you may find that, well, I got to have the heifers, and I'm going to get my cost down, or I had extra costs this year because of the drought, or whatever it is, and you may end up buying that heifer at a higher price. But recognize that this assumes that everything that FAPRI says happens, that you have the same productivity and you have the same cost, and you can make adjustments in that in the way you feel about it, about what to pay for a heifer, based on the fact that, okay, look, this year's exceptionally high cost, but I normally have a cost that's lower and it's about this much. So instead of the $899, let's say, well, my cost is normally around $780. So you go, well, I got 776 and 700. And then I usually have my call rate, which I think averages not 19% because it was exceptionally high year, but my average call rate is around 16%. So you go 776 and you go 8. So you can pay between $1,849 and $1,897 is what would be right, given the fact that your productivity was about that, and that your calf size is approximately that, and that the prices in the future. And the problem with the prices in the futures is we don't know, nobody knows, FAPRI doesn't know, but you've got to make a decision based on what you think is going to happen, and that's what you're going to go with. So let's say you look at FAPRI prices, you go and look that up, and you say, you know what, these prices are way too low. Then you could say, if your decision making is based on your thinking, you could say, well, I can pay more for my heifers than what these people say. And that's fine. But what if you say, well, FAPRI is not so much right, I think they're too high. Well, then you're going to want to be more conservative and pay less than what we say. So that's how you would use this information.
Okay, can we go to the next slide? So just in conclusion, some things to think about. Increased productivity without changing costs results in greater revenue and a higher break-even value for replacement heifers. So productivity changes could include improvement in calving rate, a better pregnancy rate, or a calf growth rate that's bigger, so you're selling larger calves. And there's a lot of other factors there too. Revenue changes due to higher or lower calf prices than call cows affects your break-even value similarly. Increasing revenue means you have a higher break-even value for cow replacements and vice versa. A prime example was back, when we had the drought of 2012, we sold a lot of cows, and then that next year when things picked up in a couple of years, like 2014, people paid a lot of money for cows following that drought, and the cow value the next year went
Wouldn't you
Uh,
say that that's gonna be, maybe be a problem coming up?
Yes, due to droughts gonna affect it this year because our cow numbers are down because people have to sell cows because they run out of grass. And so, yeah, the cow values are gonna be higher. But then when we start, when we build back the herd back up in 10 years and the prices go down because we've got a larger herd, that end value of that cow is gonna be less. So that's a difference in depreciation.
So
you
here's
see
what
over
I'd be
time.
thinking if I was you, Randy, if I was a cattle guy. And, I'd like to think of myself as knowing something about it, but at the same time, I don't own any cows, so maybe I'm talking out of turn here, but here's what I would be thinking about. I'd be thinking, okay, if the cows have a really high price this time around, and I want to increase my cow herd because I really depopulated because of drought, what's that cost going to cost me? So I think I would go somewhere and I do some maybe back of the envelope, or I do some calculations, say, okay, so here's what I'm going to pay for them. Here's my call rate. Here's how much I'm going to go for as far as length of time, longevity on average. Are these cows going to end up paying for themselves? Or do I need the cash flow to stay in business? And even though it's going to cost me, is it worth the extra value of paying for those cows? Well, that's a decision that only you can make based on what your costs are and all those factors that I talked about. Now, if you have a struggle figuring that out, which it's not necessarily an easy calculation because there's a lot of things going on, you're more than welcome to come talk to Randy or myself, and we can help you disentangle it. Or there's other educators or other people, or other people can help you. But to be truthful with you, you've got to be careful not to throw too much money because it'll take you forever to pay it back. And then there'll be another drought, and then you'll be in trouble. So those are things that I would be thinking about. But at the other end of it, maybe those cows are a reasonably enough price for you in your area to say, hey, this isn't a bad deal. I can make this work, and I need this many cows. And those are decisions everyone's going to have to make. I would just caution you to be careful and make sure that you make the decision that works best for your business, your situation, and your financial standing.
Hey, Matt, so we have some questions.
Do we?
So I think I guess we got a few more things, I guess, in the conclusion, and we'll go to those questions. So we pretty much talked about this, how in the future it can affect your values depending on what happens as far as a drought, what happens as far as calf prices, and actually just inflation, how it affects us. So a positive outcome to purchasing and replacing heifer comes down to the ability of the heifer to return as much or more value than was paid for her, right? The depreciation cost and all that. So if she can at least pay for herself in the long run with her calves and stuff, she's done her job for you. And then selecting the right one is really important to fit your operation. It's important to making profit regardless of whether you're buying or raising. So getting that right heifer that fits your management style is really important.
Okay,
and there's our website. You can go to this link here. It'll take you to that heifer values. I think he put it in the chat too. Ryan did. And then you can put your phone up to this screen here, this N, and you can, it'll take you to the website. The questions we have, is it being assumed these replacement heifers are not pregnant?
No, you're bought at the time that you're going to buy them within a month. We have them purchase it as if they're going to be productive cows or pregnant. They're ready to go probably within a month or less. That's how I assumed it.
Yeah, probably you're buying them this January or bought them in December for March calves. And then our annual bull cost similar to the annual cow costs when looking at a whole herd budget, or the bull cost analyzed separately. So we put in average bull cost in this.
We have about between $4,000 and $6,000 per head for bull. We have 25 bulls per every head of cows. That's part of that's modeled directly in. That's what they kind of do at GSL. And that's a biological fact that's already in there. There's another fact that we could talk about a whole nother time, is that as 25 too few cows for bulls, especially if you got them in groups. I would say some of the research, at least from what I understand, is about 35 head per bull. And believe me, that can make a difference on getting cows pregnant and your cost. But it's something that, you know, individuals have to look at.
And that would depend on the age of the bull too. Matt's talking mature bulls. A younger bull, like a yearling, I would not put that many with them, but
Right.
a
Mr.
mature
Animal
bull,
Scientist over there telling you the right things.
right.
I'm screwing up.
Okay, that's okay. It's just you got to be a mature bull. Is there a way to accommodate your cows less than 10 years old in these calculations?
What was the question again, Randy?
So is there a way to accommodate young cows less than 10 years old in these calculations? So let's say you sold them at a younger age.
Okay. This is a tricky question, and we need to do, and I need to do some more work on it. So I don't know that, but here's what I would be careful of. You can sell a younger cow that has a higher resale value than an older cow that has less productive life left if she's pregnant. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, that means though, if you sell her for more, that you lose less on depreciation, but that also means you have a shorter productive life. And that shorter productive life then is how much did she return on each calf? And so the answer to the question is, did she return enough on each calf to sell her at that rate? Or is it that much more expensive to take the total depreciation versus not the depreciation? And I suspect, to be perfectly honest with you, it's a suspicion, not necessarily a fact. And so you're going to have to figure it out yourself, is that it depends on the situation and how much you're selling your cows worth. If you're a guy, a producer in an area that has a reputation for great cows and can receive a premium for those cows at a younger age, you probably can make that work. If you're selling those cows at auction rates, it probably is going to be a wash. And that's just from my familiarity with the information. So yeah, it could work, but you're going to have to make sure that it does work by actually cranking through the numbers and doing things. I need to do some simulation on it, and when I do, I'll probably publish a paper on it. That'd be a great thing to publish a paper on, because it's valuable information to you guys.
We've had that question before, so we probably need to work on that. One more question. Can you revisit how to determine low, average, high, how to determine low, average, high cost producer classification?
Say that again.
Can you revisit how to determine low, average, high cost producer classification? We just figured them from actual cost in Nebraska, right?
Well, we used the budgets that were created. We also then, and those are things like, okay, so we left out any depreciation costs, and that's calculated in the model based on the individual animal. So each individual animal had that cost differently. So if the animal only lasted one lactation, I'm sorry, I'm talking dairy here, one calf, that would be different than a cow that lasted 4 or 5, 6, 7 calves or whatever they lasted. So that's could be a different depreciation. That was unique to the cow. That is controlled by how the average age of your herd, because the average age of your herd indicates what your call rate is going to be. In other words, if your average age is a certain number, that means you're calling cows at a certain rate, and you have so many old cows, so many young cows, and it averages out to a certain age. That kind of tells you what it is. The call rate is really important in calculating that. So it really depends on that. The question then is, again, Randy, just to make sure I got it.
So I think there's a little more to it. So can you revisit how to determine low, average, and high? So we figured those low, average, and high costs from looking at what producers are renting land for what the feed costs were. And we figured kind of an average, and then we went above the average and below the average.
Well, we started with the budgets.
Right.
So I was talking about as far as like vet cost, as far as all those other costs, we use the budgeted amounts. And I believe there's an inflation factor involved in the budgets this year.
And the other thing is, these costs may seem a little low to some people, but remember, we don't have depreciation in there because it's in the model. And there may be a couple other things we don't have in there because it's in the model.
Well, if they seem low, I would say you're in trouble if your costs are higher than that, because even at the $900 level, if you think that's low and it's actually more than that, your cost, that means you're going to be paying a lot less for, you should be paying a lot less for your replacements. So and again, and FAPRI actually has a lower number than we do, and they drop out replacement costs as well. So if you think that your cost is lower than ours, in fact, you can figure out what your costs are, and you should know what your costs are. And you can say, well, look, my costs are only $600. I mean, because maybe you got a deal on pasture rent, maybe you got all kinds of things going for you, or you figure your ownership cost is less than that, or whatever, and you put your costs in there, and those are your actual true costs. That means you could pay more than $2,200 for a heifer, assuming your call rate was at 14% or whatever rate it was.
Right.
So that's figuring your cost is, okay, what does it cost me? I mean, that would include if your cost of your personal draws or whatever you got in there, all your pasture costs, your truck, your tractors, all your things, whatever you got in there. And this is what it cost me on a per cow basis. Okay.
Right.
Then you can put that and consider that what it is. And that's not with the replacement cost. In other words, the loss you're going to take when you go from a productive cow to a sold cow.
I think we've covered that pretty well. The one thing I would say is that Aaron Berger does a unit cost of production program, and you might want to go there and learn from him it would help you figure those costs if you're having trouble, or you could come to us and we could work with you on that.
Well, how about the cow? There's also the cow cost calculator, which is a one-page thing, pretty simple. You can get a really good idea really quickly about what your costs are, because it lists things like, what does it cost for this? What does it cost for that? And you just put it in there and say, well, I spent about this much per cow last year. This is how much my call rate is. It'll even give you cost of replacement value loss and costs as well. It gives you pasture costs. It gives you all those costs. You just put them in on what you believe that you're paying, or your checkbook or whatever. It should give you a good approximation of what your cost is.
Your costs are. Yep, that would work very well. I think our time is getting close. I do not see any more questions. Ryan put on the screen or in the chat the address to the cow calculators, and so you can look at those and get those from us.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, Ryan, thanks. We want to thank you for joining our webinar today. Everyone for joining us today. A recording of the webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu, where you can also register for other upcoming webinars that will be scheduled for after the new year. And I guess this is after the new year. So we would also really appreciate your feedback on a brief evaluation at the link in the chat box. So please give us evaluation. It helps us know what you like and what you don't. And that helps us to how today went, how informed you were, and what you would like for future webinars. So thanks again for joining us, and we appreciate your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really am not in the Bahamas. This is actually a picture coming from North Platte.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're off.
Wow.